from our Haftorah in 2 Kings, what we find are two damsels in great distress. And maybe I'm putting that lightly. What they were facing was very horrific. We have one woman, a godly woman. Her husband was a prophet, and he dies. He leaves behind some debt, and so the creditor was coming to take her two children to be his slaves. You could imagine the great horror on her heart, losing her husband, and now losing her sons because of a debt that was unpaid. And then later in that chapter, we read about a Shunammite woman who was very hospitable and very giving, who did so much to help the prophet Elisha, building a room for him that when he would come through, that they would take full care of them. Well, God had promised to this woman a son, and the son had died. So you have two women with horrible circumstances. And the long and short, it was because of their godly nature, because of the way they put God first. This woman who faced an insurmountable debt saw a miracle performed before her eyes with this miracle of God multiplying oil in many vessels that she sold and was able to maintain herself. And as for the Shunammite woman whose promised son had died, he was raised to life. And these remind us that when we serve the Lord, when our heart is on Him and Him alone, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of how fearful, He answers with signs, wonders, and miracles, and He comes along and He comforts those who hurt, comforts those who mourn. God rewards those who honor Him. So that said, I want to turn to the message that I have prepared this morning. And before I get into the message, I just want to say, Louise, it's so awesome to see you. It is wonderful. Welcome home. You know, in our hearts, this is your home. Will always be good to see you. And on a personal note, 55 years ago, this young 13-year-old dude went before the congregation at Temple Beth David near Israel, and he was called as a bar mitzvah. And this was my Torah, half-Torah portion on that day that is such a wonderful and distant memory 55 years ago. So whenever we get around to this parsha, there's just something special about it. I think it would be a gross understatement on my part if I were to tell you that this has been a very stressful week. It has been very, very stressful. And when I look back over this, you know, I put a lot of pressure on myself because I want to bring something that's going to be encouraging. I want to bring something that we could latch onto, something that we could take with us. And I don't bound myself to the weekly Torah, half-Torah cycle. If there is something that speaks to me, I'm going to go for it. And my intent really was not to look at the parsha because my thoughts were there are so many other great references that I can use, but I read the parsha and I come away with a different perspective. And I come away with a greater measure of the greatness of Abraham. We know of his greatness, but I don't think we really, really, truly understand the depth of this, the greatness of this man. Because there's always new things that come to mind. And the lessons that we can learn from Abraham are so dynamically instrumental to us in this hour. And this is the beauty of Scripture. It is God-breathed, and it speaks to us, and it touches our hearts in every generation. When God looked at Abraham, He knew the material that He was working with. He found in this man a heart of gold, a man who was 100% sold out to His purposes. A man named Abraham who, like no other individual ever, understood and lived out and practiced the true measure and meaning of the biblical foundation, love your neighbor as yourself. And short of reading my text, because it's already been read, and the Torah blessing has already been pronounced, I'm going to move on beyond a reading of Genesis 18, just to jar your memory. 3 guests appear to Abraham in the heat of the day. He sees these wayfarers coming, and he immediately breaks out that Abraham, renowned hospitality, takes care of their every need and waits on them. And so when I think about this Abraham story, I think of a place called Genesis Land. In the land of Israel, there is a unique tourist destination that's called Genesis Land. Genesis Land is located in the Judean wilderness between Jerusalem and the area of the Dead Sea. From their website is the following. Visitors to Genesis Land are greeted by Eliezer, Abraham's servant, and by a train of camels which lead you down to Abraham's tent, where you will experience his legendary hospitality. Perhaps you'll witness the courtship of Isaac and Rebekah. You might even come across Joseph and his brothers just before they throw him into the pit. At Genesis Land, the stories of the Bible come to life in the very same landscape from which they took place. Genesis Land accentuates the one standout feature of the greatness of Abraham, namely his hospitality. In Jewish thought, Abraham's hospitality and his devotion to the needs of others supersedes the more common associations of his great faith. In Genesis Land, you are brought by camel to Abraham's tent and treated to the finest comforts and hospitality. And I have to add, you have to sit on the ground. I don't have much flexibility. So I went from my knees to standing, but that's another thing. But this is Abraham, the man who welcomed 3 visitors that came to his tent. That in the heat of the day, 3 men appear to him, and without hesitation, he prostrates himself in humility, offers to wash their feet, and to bring them something to eat and drink. This indeed is a very compassionate act, but even more so when we consider it was the hottest time of the day. He is 99 years old, and he had just undergone a circumcision. It hurts just thinking about it. Yet, he jumped into action, forgetting his own discomforts and infirmities to take care of 3 visitors. Abraham's home was a home of kindness. It was a home where the master of the house would run to greet nomadic wanderers, where their needs would supersede his own. The placard on his front lawn read, "Hate has no home here." And he lived it as no one has ever done. It wasn't a pretentious show of sentimental silliness. The fact of the matter is that these individuals have been blinded by their own hatred. Interestingly, in Jewish sources, Abraham is not described as one who excelled in faith per se, as much as he is described as an individual who loved God. His love for God was manifest in his love for people, and it translated into his being hospitable and welcoming. In Genesis 18, it affords us this interesting contrast. On the one hand, you have the hospitable nature of Abraham juxtaposed by the complete and opposite in Sodom and Gomorrah, where they were brutal, anything but hospitable. Whereas in the tents of Abraham, you find hospitality and welcome. In Sodom, you find brutality and reproach. You go from extreme kindness and charity to extreme evil and wickedness. And while the contrasts are night and day, Abraham remains constant and consistent in his care and concern for the catastrophic conditions of Sodom and Gomorrah. For those coming to the tents of Abraham, it was meeting kindness, and then ultimately it came down to God meeting justice. Abraham was the best friend to those who stood guilty. Abraham was a friend to those who stood condemned. It was Abraham who interceded powerfully to God on their behalf. It was Abraham who interceded mightily for the same people who kidnapped his family, forcing him to chase down these bad guys as far north as Damascus. Abraham's concern was certainly for his nephew Lot and his family, but he interceded on behalf of the entire city, and not just his family. As a society, as a nation, so much of what we've been witnessing for years, both socially and politically, is sheer hatred in a very, very rare moment of honesty. Hillary Clinton described people of our ilk as being a basket of deplorables. You know, this has been a very stressful week. And to me, what makes it stressful is the sheer amount of hatred that is out there. There is nothing virtuous about hatred. And if I may paraphrase an old Beatles number, when I find myself in times of trouble, His Spirit comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. See, Abraham breaks all of these molds. He intercedes for those who are guilty. He intercedes for those that had done him and his family so much wrong. And our response must emulate the high moral character of our father Abraham. He interceded for some really deplorable people, and yet a tenet of the Torah instructs us to love your neighbor, to love the stranger among you, because it is in loving the stranger that we discover the very essence and what it means, to use the term humanity, to be a family of man. And what other civilization is there the demand to love the stranger? As followers of Messiah, it is unwise, unhealthy, and unproductive to harbor any kind of hatred. And I have a question for you to ponder. The answer to this question will absolutely open up to you the importance of Genesis 18. It will give us another insight to universal redemption. And it'll challenge our zeal to reach people for the Messiah. And it will remind us anew of our purpose, mission, and vision. And the question is this: why do these three divine visitors feel impelled to tell Abraham of their intents regarding Sodom and Gomorrah? We read in Genesis 18:17, the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed." See, this statement appears in every reference of the Abrahamic promise. It says, "For I have chosen him so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him." If ever there was a key figure, it was unmistakably Abraham. Just consider that God was not going to make a radical move without first consulting his servant Abraham. There's something to be said when we align ourselves with the Lord and we become his servants, that he enables us and he gives to us discernment and insight to know how to pray, to know which direction that we ought to go. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? God made it a priority to give Abraham this valuable insider information. There was more on the agenda than to simply bring forth a birth announcement. They didn't come just to tell him that your wife is going to conceive and have a child. In light of this reality, one cannot overlook the fact that in the past 4 years, our country has never had a more pro-Israel president. With such backing, is it any wonder that once hostile nations are now seeking to normalize relations with Israel? And this is a dynamic that Pat brought forth earlier. As opposed to the previous regime that gave Iran nearly $1 billion in cash to foster a nuclear program that would be aimed directly at Israel, as well as to aid and abet worldwide terror networks. See, these are realities. I'm not just pulling this out of the air. Psalm 125 offers this prayer point that we need to intercede and pray into. And it tells us, may all who hate Zion be driven back in disgrace. May all who hate Zion be driven back in disgrace. I believe that in the spiritual realm, the enemies of Israel are on the attack. A spiritual warfare intended to weaken and to handicap the Jewish state. Genesis 18 upholds this position as we see the grandeur of ADONAI along with 2 angels appearing to him. May all who hate Zion be driven back in disgrace. These predetermined plans and purposes of God will never be rescinded, revoked, or replaced. And this Messianic synagogue that you now worship in is representative of God's ultimate purpose of redemption to the world. That ideal to the Jew first that Rabbi Shaul speaks of. It's a dynamic of the regathering of a faithful remnant amongst Israel for the purpose of bringing greater and wider blessings of salvation to the world. It is not a fluke that some of the president's closest advisors are Messianic Jews. Be it Jonathan Kahn, be it Jay Sekulow, and another gentleman who spoke at our conference nationally 2 years ago. But he's surrounding himself and listening to the voices of Messianic Jews. See, it is through this meeting of kindness that we guide and we warn others as to avert God's meeting of justice. The meeting of kindness is seen in Abraham's chosenness and calling. For I've chosen him to command his children and household to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness. And thus he stridently appeals to God to spare the guilty for the sake of the righteous. Is our task any less? All around us we are witnessing an anti-Messiah spirit being unleashed on the earth. So many good and well-meaning people, loved ones, friends, all deceived by the lies being spewed forth by the secular arena. All under the sway of world forces of wickedness in high places. If we can't love and pray for those who oppose us, if we cannot love and pray for those who we might think in our heart as being enemies, then we cease to be salt and light. See, this is what Abraham teaches me in addition, that he could pray for those who are wicked and evil who have done him wrong. This is the gold God saw within the heart of Abraham. He was a disciple. He taught all who knew him to keep the way of the Lord by doing justice, treating others with kindness and justice. How large was Abraham's household? Is it just Sarah and the family of Lot? Genesis 14:14. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. See, he led out his trained men. The Hebrew for trained is chanik, and it is the root of chanuk, or dedicated. This is where we get Hanukkah, the feast of dedication. And I want you to pause for a moment and consider 318 men chase down and defeat 5 kings. 5 kings who just defeated 4 other kings. And so Deuteronomy 32:20 reminds us, how can one chase 1,000 and 2 put 10,000 to flight? Unless their rock had sold them and ADONAI had handed them over. See, with God, all things are possible. We might feel and we might think that the burden is so overwhelming that there is no chance at all for us to overcome. But one can take 1,000 to flight. And this is what we see as 318 men defeated, chased down 5 kings. Now I've got so many notes and I got to skip through a lot of things. But, meeting kindness. Now, where did it all begin with Abraham? Is there perhaps a starting point? Did he have an example or a role model to follow? And I say yes. Genesis 14:17-19. Then after his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." Abraham treated these 3 guests in the same way that he himself was also treated by this mysterious and highly intriguing person by the name of Melchizedek. Abraham is weary. He just returned from war for many days, and he is exhausted from travel. And then he is refreshed with bread and wine from Melchizedek. Who is Melchizedek? Hebrew, this is the king of righteousness. This is the king of peace, the king of Jerusalem, and he blesses and he honors Abraham. Abraham is great, but this one is even greater. He's greater because Abraham gives to him a tithe. And I believe, like many do, that this is a visitation of the angel of the Lord, a visitation of the Messiah to his servant Abraham to refresh him. And when the time comes, he returns the blessing in kind, not knowing who it was that he was entertaining. And this is that opening scene of Genesis 18. Genesis 18:13 tells us that one of these men is the Lord himself. Imagine that. The Lord, the creator of heaven and earth, appears as a man to announce a miracle birth. This miracle birth, this making something out of nothing, would be to fulfill the covenant God made with his servant Abraham. The other 2 are identified as angels. Oh, the merits of meeting kindness. Hebrews 13:2 reminds us, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. And all of our culture wars, in this day of great conflict, division, and hate, these things must not rub off on us. Let's handle adversity through the meeting of kindness and leave it to the Lord to meet justice. For judgment, Yaakov says, is merciless to the one who does not show mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Through it all, and I know that each of us would agree, we want justice, but what we really need is mercy. And lastly, I want to close on a highly encouraging note. Isn't the Holy One able to deliver in our darkest hour? Yes, Barb, I borrowed that from one of your amazing songs of years past. Now you know the song. But isn't he able to deliver us in our darkest hour? The corresponding Haftorah reading from 2 Kings, where the prophet Elisha is approached by a godly woman whose husband died. Worse than that, leaves behind a debt, and the creditor was coming to take her children as slaves. Can you imagine the depth of the grief on the part of this woman? And from there we come upon a hospitable couple extending great kindness to the prophet. And for her hospitality and kindness, God miraculously heals her barrenness, and she becomes a mother. But when the child dies, leaving this couple in great anguish and pain, we are reminded of God's power to raise the dead and perform miracles. It reminds us that in this sin-cursed world, adversity and anguish are never far away. Yet in the broader scheme of things, these nightmarish events open up the door for God to provide supernatural victories. They tell of supernatural power of God to supernaturally provide, to create life, and to raise the dead. In a recent article by Dr. Michael Brown, he notes that God works in ways that confound our natural way of thinking. That like a chess master, God's moves are well ahead of ours. Dr. Brown gives the following examples of how the deepest times of crisis are turned around for God's glory. And I want to cite but one of the things he cites. He says, the greatest crime ever committed by human beings was to crucify the Son of God. Yet, that was the act God used to make salvation available to the world. And without the crucifixion, there would be no resurrection. Who saw this coming in advance? Only the Lord himself. Proceeds to talk about Joseph. His brothers did so much evil to him. He's thrown into a pit to die, sold into slavery, gets into Egypt, he's imprisoned, and then he's put out, falsely accused, into prison. He went through so much grief, and who would have thought that God, being who he is, was so many steps ahead, that God would use this evil done to him to be the salvation of his family, to be the salvation of the people of Israel. And he tells his brothers, the things you did, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. We don't know what the future will look like, but I am so safe and assured that the future is one that God knows, and he is well in control. And like that master chess player, he's able to see things far beyond, infinitely beyond what we are able to see and imagine. And that is where our hope is. And there are so many things we could say. If it was not for the horrors of the Holocaust, it is so unlikely that the United Nations would have ever had the support, not to mention the support to vote Israel in as a nation, not to mention the massive exodus of Jewish people fleeing Europe and occupying and going into that land. Strike that word occupied from the tape. Will you please, Hans, take care of that for me? But this was the catalyst that brought the Jewish people back to the land in fulfillment of our prophets of old. It took a little shaking going on to get us back there. And sometimes it takes a little shaking and a little unrest within the heart for us to be motivated to move forward. You know, what if, I mean, just consider this scenario as I'm finally going to close. See, a concern is this: should the president prevail, would it bring believers to a place of complacency where we would let our guard down? You see, if it does not go accordingly, then, our mission shouldn't change or be altered in the least. That regardless of the outcome, there is no time, there is no place for us to take the foot off the pedal. We've got to continually living and moving for God's purposes. There's no room for complacency whatsoever. Let us grow stronger in the things of God regardless of outcomes. We need to move forward and put our full trust in Him. Oh, Lord God, we come to you with a thankfulness that at times is inexpressible. We cannot put into proper words the debt of gratitude for which we owe you. In all things, you have told us we are more than conquerors through Him who loves us. Your love for us is deep, wide, immense, that at a time when judgment could have been rendered to each of us, you extended mercy. And although we love justice, we need mercy more than anything. Lord, your servant Abraham had the mind of Messiah. He loved his neighbors. He took care of the stranger at the gate. The maligned, lonely stranger at the gate, He took in. God, that you would move upon our hearts a deeper love and a compassion for all peoples. Help us, Lord, and check our hearts against the evil of hatred, that there be no rancor and no animus in our hearts. Correct us, Lord, when and where we need that kind of correction. For you are a God of justice. But more than justice, you extend mercy. And it is through your mercy that we could live, move, and have our being. Blessed are you, O eternal, our King, who raises the dead, who one day will raise us, either from the dead or by the return of our soon-coming King. We come in thankfulness. Let your complete good work be accomplished within us. It's in Yeshua's name I pray. Amen and amen.